Are you listening? Damn. Yeah.
For helping to pay for my presentation. And what I'm going to talk about is something that we're all pretty familiar with, common sense and controversies in the hobby. There's very little of the former and a lot of the latter, and that's part of the problem we have with the hobby, is that there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I'm going to go over some of the things that I've found, some of my experiences, and you can take it from there, and somehow this isn't working. Okay. There we go. As I said, thank Mazda for coming, or for bringing me. And as all of you know, when you get into the hobby, you think, well, this isn't going to be too bad, but you have to get to the point where things die and you lose money seemingly overnight. As I said 30 years ago, and what's interesting is the first time I spoke in Cleveland for CC was 1987. So a lot of you weren't even born yet, and I was already speaking here. So that gives you some idea of how long I've been doing this. But when we started doing this, things weren't quite as expensive as they are now. Many of the corals that I now see out there for $500, $600, $1,000, we were paying $10 and $15 for. So the hobby has changed a lot. One, there's a lot more people in it. When we started, there were basically 8 of us in the US, and we knew each other because we talked to each other and tried to figure out what's going on and what wasn't working. Now worldwide, there's over 1 million hobbyists keeping reef tanks. So needless to say, the hobby has been very successful and has grown a significant amount. Now before I get into some things, I basically always show a picture of my tank because it's my belief that if you're going to talk about stuff, you should see if people should have some belief that you have a clue what you're talking about. So I always show my tank. This is my 300-gallon tank. I have 5 other tanks in the house. 2 120s, a 90-gallon frag tank, a 26-gallon nano tank, and I even have a 60-gallon Plankton tank. So I basically have every kind of tank there is. One's soft corals, one's LPS, this one's SPS, and they're all pretty much packed like this, which is one of my shortcomings. Joe Yaiolo has coined a phrase, we're coralaholics. Actually, I think it's worse than heroin because you can get this on the street easier and it's not illegal, but you can spend just as much money on it. Now, as most of us get into the hobby, one of the things we tend to neglect is the tank. We don't really put a lot of money or effort into the tank, and it's actually one of the cheapest things that we buy, but it's one of the things that we tend to neglect. This is my Elos tank. This retails for about $5,000. Why did I spend that kind of money on it? It is the nicest piece of furniture in my house, needless to say. The stand will last long beyond when I'm gone. It's made of there's a substance on the outside that basically makes it immune to salt, spills, anything that you could do. The sand is steel, and the tank itself is as nicely done as possible. You can see the edges and the lines. It's just a perfectly made piece of equipment. And not just in the tank when we put them up, one of the things we also tend to neglect is the aesthetics of the tank. That is, how nice is the tank going to look in the room? And I only put this tank in this room roughly 2 years ago. I've lived in my house now for 9 years, and all of my relatives said, you should put a tank in this room, it would be perfect. I'm going, nah. This is how nice that tank looks in that room. It's also primarily a sunlight-driven tank. That is, I just have 2 Kessels on for blue light at night, but most of the corals get their light from the tank, from sunlight. Beside the windows, there's 4 skylights in the room that put light on the tank for roughly 6 hours, natural sunlight. So looking at the aesthetics of the tank is one of the things we need to do that we don't often show a lot of common sense when we're setting up the tank. We set it up, it's here, and we neglect how it's going to affect the room and the rest of the house. And when we set up the tank, oftentimes one of the things that we will try to do is as little as possible. This is the do little aquarium system where you don't really do a lot to it. And even though we want that, a lot of times, in the end, this is the kind of tank that we want. But you have to realize when you set up a reef tank, it's not a television set. You can't just turn it on and go. Anyone that sets up a reef tank, once you've been in it for a while, realizes that you have to put a lot of effort into it. Most of the people that I know that are very successful with this are borderline obsessive compulsive. So we spend a lot of time on little tiny things. When I go around and visit people's tanks, which is one of the things I've been lucky enough to do over the last 30 years, I see that a lot of people share this commonality, is that they obsess about little tiny things. They'll see a little dead spot on a coral, they immediately remove it. They'll see something fell over, they take it out. Those are the people that are most successful in this hobby, is you have to put a fair amount of effort to it. Some people just walk away and don't have to put their hands in their tank, and God bless them. I've never been like that. I always have things I have to move around and prune or whatever. Now there's a lot of equipment in the hobby now, but as with any equipment, if you don't know what you're doing with it, it's not going to work properly. Case in point, skimmers. You can get the most elaborate skimmer, you can set up the most impressive filtration devices and systems possible, but the bottom line is a skimmer just takes gunk out of the water. The easiest way to maintain a skimmer is to clean it relatively frequently. There's now self-cleaning heads and everything else. Just in some of my own experiments, I went from cleaning a skimmer once a week to cleaning it every day. By cleaning it every day, I dramatically improved the amount of skimming that was coming out of it. The reason being is you get that brown scum on the neck, most of it falls back into the tank, it doesn't work as well. So now when I redo my next tank, I'm going to set it so my skimmer can sit outside of the tank with a self-cleaning head, which will make it much more efficient. So I can save money on not necessarily having to buy a bigger skimmer, and I'll spend some of that money on a self-cleaning head, which will make my life much easier. So that's one of the things in terms of common sense. Make doing stuff on your tank as easy as possible, because the easier it is for you to do, the more likely you are to do it. Currently, my skimmer requires me to drain it, unscrew it, move it onto the bottom of the tank, and clean it. That's not something I like doing every day, but I did it as an experiment to see which one worked better. That works significantly better, but it's not easy to do. You can even buy skimmers that are square now. You can get any size skimmer, any type of skimmer you want. It doesn't really matter. No one's really done the research to say, this skimmer is significantly better than this. The main thing, as I said, that you need to do is clean it and make it work that way. They're all going to basically do the same thing for the most part. We also have now much better equipment coming out. This is the new Destaco calcium reactors that I'm running, and they're basically totally automated. When I say totally automated, with the old calcium reactors, you had to adjust the flow, you had to adjust the bubble count, you had to adjust everything. With this device, there's just a knob on the side. You turn to the level you want, you check your level, and when it's at the right level, that's it. It stays as flat line, straight on alkalinity-wise of any piece of equipment I've ever used. The only problem is I get lazy. I'm thinking alkalinity is perfect, so calcium and magnesium are perfect. Unfortunately, not everything is consumed at the same rates. So over the course of using this for 3 months and having my alkalinity spot on every day, I'm thinking, okay, my calcium and magnesium levels are good. Well, my calcium level had dropped down to 300 and my magnesium had dropped down to 900. What you really want to keep them at is significantly higher than that. Calcium at 400, magnesium over 1400. I couldn't figure out why I was having issues since my alkalinity was perfect. That's just common sense. You still have to do testing on your tanks to measure these things. You can't think that just because one parameter is perfect, the others are perfect as well. That's why I have a KH Guardian that tells me that my KH is perfect. Now I'm right now beta testing a new device that will also measure my magnesium and my calcium levels. So what I'm hoping is this will all make things easier from a monitoring standpoint, so I don't have to do the every 2 days, every week testing. Because before I put the Destaco reactor on and this device on, I was measuring my alkalinity once or twice a day because it was bouncing all over the place. Now, like I said, it's straight line. It may move 0.2 during the course of the day, where previously it was moving anywhere from 1 to 1.5 points per day. Now, in terms of controversies, there's always a lot of things going on. If you read all the threads and everything going on with the internet, one of the things that has stirred a lot of the pot, so to speak, is microbubbles. What are microbubbles? Well, if you ever go diving, one of the things that you'll notice when you're underwater is you'll see like little glimmers of light reflecting off of stuff. Typically what that is sunlight reflecting off of all the water bubbles that are underneath in the water. Well, the people at Philippine Corals started working on these nanobubbles and introducing them to the tank for a number of reasons. One, adding more microbubbles increases the oxygen levels in the tank, but they also found by doing so, it causes the corals to slough off more slime and as a result cleanse themselves of impurities and grow faster. And here's just the simple system that I use. Basically, you have an air stone that sits over the overflow in the sump. The water goes over, the big bubbles go up, the nano bubbles, which are bubbles that remain because they're buoyant neutral, stay within the water, get sucked into the tank, and basically what they do, this is a device I built myself, they make the entire tank act like a protein skimmer. That is, you know how a protein skimmer works, where you have bubbles moving up against the water, the dirt or proteins adhere to it, and it gets skimmed out. With this, by having the nanobubbles, you can see that on the one side here is the sump, nanobubbles coming up. The entire sump acted like a protein skimmer. So I'm taking out more dirt than I ever was with a protein skimmer alone, plus I'm keeping the oxygen levels much higher. Now, why is this important? Because when you have these nanobubbles going across the bottom of the tank, they tend to adhere to a lot of the detritus. You're wondering, what am I showing you here? This is a white bucket that I put detritus in and let it sit on the bottom overnight. That black is anaerobic. It basically started forming just after 24 hours. So if you have dead spots that have low oxygen levels within your tank, you're going to have the same kind of anaerobic activity. To me, I've never had anything good happen in an anaerobic environment. So this is why you want to do something like this. Good, strong water flow, and these nanobubbles has made a significant difference in my tank. Basically what it did was it raised the redox potential about 50 points. Now, redox potential, for those of you that don't know, is kind of a measure of how clean the water is. You don't want to have it so clean that nothing will grow, but you want to have it between 300 and 400. Mine went from 320 to 370, just going with these nanobubbles. Now, what did I do to make the nanobubbles? I had an old Tetra air pump, I had a wooden air stone, I stuck it on a piece of firm tubing, stuck it in the pump overflow, it goes over, and I got nanobubbles in the tank. Cruz and Julian suggested only running this at night. I run it 24/7 because I didn't see a whole lot of difference between just running it at night and during the day. Some of the things that they claim is that it will take out cyanobacteria. I've had it work in a couple of tanks. I've had it not work in some other tanks. So it's still 50-50 on that. But what I have seen happen is, before I ran the nanobubbles, I was cleaning the glass every 2 to 3 days. Since I've been running the nanobubbles, I have to clean the glass once a week. Small thing, but for the $15 air pump and a wooden air stone, to me, not having to clean the tank but once a week instead of 2 or 3 times a week is a big time saver. Because this is the least favorite thing I do in my tank, is cleaning the glass. I don't know if you guys like cleaning the glass, but nothing good happens when I'm cleaning the glass. You get a piece of sand under, you scratch the glass, you knock over a coral, you bump stuff. This made my life easier, so that's my suggestion with it. I don't know if you'll see miracle things that have been claimed by it, but it does make a difference in terms of what I look at as the overall health of the corals. Now, one of the things that we've been doing forever, or since I've been doing this, the initial thought was always keep your nutrient levels as low as possible. You want to have 0 nitrate and 0 phosphate in your tanks. And one of the main reasons we wanted those numbers is our test kits were horrible. They did not go low enough to show you that even though you were showing 0, you wanted a little bit of nitrate and phosphate in your tanks. The test kits were so bad, we couldn't do that. Now there's much better test kits out there that show you much more specific levels and higher levels. Because one of the problems, if you run your nutrients low, your tips of your corals, where your corals grow, absorb nitrate and phosphate. Those are their energy sources. If you don't have any nitrate or phosphate in your tank, you tend to get these burning of the tips of the coral like you see here. So you want to have some nitrate and phosphate in your tank. This is a tank that has nitrate and phosphate. Nitrate's over 20, phosphate's at 0.1. Needless to say, this is a healthy growing tank. This is, if you're ever in Orlando, Florida to go see SeaWorld, stop by Worldwide Coral and look at their tank. That big green coral in the middle is a Mike Paletta pink tip that I gave them a frag of 5 years ago that they've probably sold 1,000 frags off of. So keeping their nutrient levels at a reasonable level will get much faster growth. This is Sanjay Joshi's tank, which you've all seen videos of. Sanjay keeps his nitrates at sometimes up to 0.4 and his nitrates over 40. He has a huge fish load in his tank. He has a massive amount of water flow, roughly 60 times the volume of the tank, and he has really bright lights on the tank. Sanjay grows corals faster than anyone I've ever met, and he's been growing them that way for the 25 years that I've known him. So he has always kept his nutrient levels higher. In my case, my nutrient levels got so low, I had to add nitrogen and phosphate into the tank to keep the corals growing. Even though I feed heavy, and you saw how packed the tank is with fish, I still had to add these because the corals were growing so fast. This is Sanjay's tank. That purple thing in the bottom is not a coral. That's actually a photosynthetic sponge. And that's one of the best ways you can see how well your tank is doing if you're growing a lot of sponges in the tank. This is a low nutrient tank. Now you just saw what Sanjay's tank looks like with high nutrients. This is a low nutrient tank. I've been going out and picking up corals in California since the early 1990s. This is what a bunch of Fiji corals used to look like, because when they came in from Fiji, they were stressed out. I don't want to keep a tank that looks stressed out like this. I know some people like the ultra low nutrient system. To me, it's like keeping your corals right on the edge of death. You may get some nice coloration, but you screw up something and they're going to be gone. Versus keeping the higher nutrient levels, you tend not to have as many problems. Looking at, you see Jason Fox out there, I visited his tanks. He has nutrient levels in his tank. I wrote an article in Reef to Reef about 4 months ago that talks about the nutrient levels of all these people's tanks, and they were all significantly higher than we had been led to believe we should keep our tanks at. And if you look at those articles, you get a good idea that you can be a lot more successful with higher nutrients and lower nutrients. Because to my mind, if I want a garish looking tank that looks like this is the kind of system I would set up. Those are all plastic fake corals, by the way. Now, one of the things I was talking about earlier is water changes. Over the years, I've tested not doing water changes, doing water changes. And as I showed you, I keep a pretty full tank that gets fed very heavily. And most of us are as lazy as my dog and don't like to do water changes, because after cleaning the glass, doing a water change is not an exciting part of the hobby. Nobody likes to get that initial mouthful of gunk that you get out of the tank or have water spill all over the floor. It's because in my mind, if you don't do water changes, keeping everything balanced is like keeping the plates on a stick. You're a lot more likely to drop something. One of your nutrients are going to go over the top, or you're going to be unbalanced with something else. So you want to try to keep things balanced. But by the same token, you don't want to make this a chore. So try to make doing water changes as simple as possible. This is a 50-gallon used pickle barrel. Matches up perfectly with a bag of salt. 50 pounds of salt, level of the water is the perfect level, makes it real easy. It takes me roughly 15 minutes to do a 50-gallon water change on my 300, which I do every 2 weeks. When I have time, I do 25 gallons a week. When I don't have time, I do 50 gallons every 2 weeks. Either way, when I had my 1,200-gallon tank, this was a 300-gallon vat. I could do the same thing. 2 knobs. Make your water changes as easy as possible. You're more likely to do them. Don't make schlepping buckets, because nobody wants to schlep buckets around your house. I don't care who you are, that's the most unfun thing you can do in the hobby, and it's bad for your back. Because I used to have to schlep buckets up and down steps, and that's even worse. This is what you get out of the tank when you do the water changes. I don't think, from my point of view, it's not what you're adding with a water change, it's the gunk you take out with a water change. I have a 3/4 inch tube with a rigid tubing on the end. I can go in every nook and cranny in the tank where I don't have enough water flow and suck this kind of gunk out of the tank. I was taking roughly between 60 and 100 grams dry weight of detritus out of the tank every week. That's a significant amount of gunk in the tank that isn't doing any good for the tank. If you don't do water changes and you let the gunk accumulate, this is what happens. In the back end of my tank where I wasn't doing water changes, you can see the cyanobacteria, you can see all the things going. If you want to grow cyanobacteria, just put detritus in a spot in your tank and let it sit there for a few days, and you'll grow cyanobacteria. It's relatively simple to do. Now, some people will say, well, I can't do a water change because I can't expose the corals to air. They're all going to die. This is my friend Art's tank in Florida. You can see the tube coming out in the center here, and the corals had grown around it. There was a frag that he put down at the bottom, and it grew up around that. You're saying, why are you showing us this? Because this is the top view of those. So when you worry about corals coming out and being exposed to air, this tank was set up with 2 pumps. One blew from the side, it shut off, and the other one blew from the side. Twice a day, both pumps were off for 30 minutes to make sure it didn't cause a problem. Well, during this 30 minutes, over time, the corals grew so well, they were literally out of the water. And this is the pre-LED system. These were under 400-watt metal halides. These corals would be exposed to 400-watt metal halides for 30 minutes a day. They were roughly 200 degrees right at the top, because this is the deepest purple coral you will ever see in your life. Exposing the corals to air is not going to kill them, as this proves. If you give them time to get accustomed to this, you don't have any problems. My corals are exposed for roughly 15 minutes. I've never lost a coral by having exposed to air during a water change. And what you also find is when you put the water back in, they all slime off a lot and throw off a lot of the garbage that's on them. It's relatively interesting, and from my point of view, very good to do this. Now, in terms of stability and water changes, one of the things that we now have at our disposal are really specific testing, the Triton testing, ICP testing. There's still a little bit of controversy about how good it is, but from my point of view, it at least gives you a much better baseline as to how good your water quality is, and it measures a lot of things. One of the interesting things, though, in America is everyone I know that sends in a test gets an ultra-high lithium level. Basically, they think that's because our water systems have lithium in their pipes for some reason. So all the tests that come from the U.S. show high lithium. All the tests from Germany and England that get sent over there, none of them show high lithium. So it's something to do with our water system that we all show high lithium. But if you look at the numbers, basically you can detect and move stuff around, because this, to me, is a lot more specific than the test kits that we have. And for $30 or $40 every 3 months, this is well worth it, considering what we pay for our corals. This is what the Triton system looks like. Their system, I tried to run it. I didn't have success for a bunch of reasons, which I won't get into. But this is a system that, from their point of view, has no water changes. All they do is balance things off and add things as they find it on the ICP test as low. It's a very interesting concept. The corals look great. The only thing you'll notice is they don't have near as many fish in their system as I do. So that may also be part of the problem, or part of the reason, or part of the reason why you want to run this. If you don't have a lot of fish in your system, this may be the system to go on without having to do a lot of water changes. Now, in terms of additives, there's now more additives on the market than I have ever seen. And by doing the ICP testing, you can see specifically what you're lacking and add it to balance things out. You don't have to just dump in a bunch of stuff not knowing where you are. The new ICP testing gives you a much better baseline from which to start. And there's now additives for virtually everything. Different coral colorations. Each one of these have things that will bring out the colorations of things. Now that we have lighting down, from my point of view, to a science, the next shortcoming is what elements are we lacking to bring out the colorations. Because we've all put corals in our tank that were yellow, that after 2 months were green, or corals that were blue that turned purple. With these additives, you can actually get the colors you want by finding out where you are with your ICP testing and then adding these colors, these additives accordingly. You can even add individual elements. You can add things like zinc, strontium. When I was in Europe, one of the things I found that there is the hot ticket for all of them is adding strontium to their tank. Now, 30 years ago, strontium was what we were all adding to our tanks, and then we were told, oh no, it's a poison, they don't need it. And talking with like Jamie Craigs at the Horniman Museum, who's actually getting corals to spawn, he adds strontium every day, and he has pictures showing the growth, adding the strontium every day and not adding the strontium every day. So needless to say, I add strontium every day to my tanks now. A small amount every day, because it gets formed in the coral matrix. It allows the stony corals to grow much faster. I don't know what it does for soft corals or anything else, but I do know the other thing that I'll do, I grow coral and algae literally out of my ears now that I add strontium to the tank. When I wasn't adding strontium, I had virtually no coral and algae anywhere in the tanks. Now that I add it, all the rocks are covered with strontium, with coral and algae. Here's another topic that we've started discussing earlier, and that's the use of miracle mud. There's a lot of people that poo-poo this on the internet. There's a lot of people that have never used it that are on the internet. I've now been using it for 21 years. I've never had a problem with it. For those of you unfamiliar with it, basically you set up a refugium, you put this miracle mud on the bottom, you put caulerpa or some other algae on top. You can do caulerpa, you can do chaeto, you can do whatever you want. Takes out a lot of the nutrients, a lot of the nitrates, it keeps things balanced. But from my point of view, it also acts as a refugium for growing microfauna. You grow amphipods, copepods, little worms, little mollusks, more stuff than you've ever seen, and a lot of that stuff will reproduce, and that thing gets dumped back into the tank, helps feed the corals, helps feed the fish. Some people have run tanks without skimmers on them and just the miracle mud. Ling actually ran a study where he ran 4 different tanks. He ran one typical Berlin, just a good skimmer. These were all exactly the same. Corals were put in the same, fish were put in the same. Everything was the same lighting, everything. The only thing that was different is one was a Berlin system with just a skimmer. One was a miracle mud system with just a mud. One was what they call the Paletta system. I did not name this after myself. It's a skimmer and a miracle mud. And then he ran a modified Paletta system where he'd run the skimmer for 6 hours at night and turn it off. And what he found was the system with the modified Paletta, that is, it ran the skimmer at night, took out more stuff than did the skimmer that was running all the time, and that tank did significantly better than the other three. They actually went in order: modified Paletta, mud system, Berlin system. Now, I saw these tanks over 2 years, and unfortunately, the way he had it set up, you couldn't take decent pictures. I have pictures of them, but you could see the difference between those. So for my money, I've run Miracle Mud on virtually every tank I've ever owned for the last 21 years. I even run it on my plant tank. I mean, it's inexpensive relative to some of the stuff that we do. And what I get is, this is my old 540-gallon tank. You can see what it looked like with a Miracle Mud. This is roughly 20 years ago. So you can see the corals were doing really well even back then, 20 years ago. And as I showed you, this is what my tank looks like now running with the Miracle Mud. So the fish stay vibrant. That Regal angelfish was actually back in that other tank. This Regal angelfish is now 18 years old. Has never shown lateral line disease. And there's so many sponges in the tank, that's what he eats. And you can see how fat it is. I also get much better coloration of my fish over time. One of the things that I found is a lot of fish over time tend to fade, or tangs and angels tend to get lateral line disease. With the Miracle Mud, I've never had those issues. And this is what basically the fish that convinced me more than anything else that Ling ever had. This is the nicest Red Sea Emperor Angel. You could literally walk in the room from here to the back wall and you would see that fish because the colors literally were blinding. He got this fish for free because it had lateral lines on his face. Within 6 months, all that lateral line had healed up, and this is what it grew into. Up until that time, I never really understood why an Emperor Angel was considered the fish you wanted to have. After seeing this fish, I understood why you wanted to have an Emperor Angel in your tank.
It's pretty.
It's if you saw it in person, it's the only problem it had at the time when Ling put it in his tank in 1997. He had the first Montipora caps anywhere, and he had virtually every color, including the Ling side cap. But he had purples, blues, reds, oranges. This fish was in that tank. All these were growing really nicely. Then all of a sudden, this fish developed an appetite for those Montiporas. So he kept the angel and lost all his Montiporas, including his Ling side cap, which fortunately he traded away and gave away to a bunch of people. So it's back and you can get it. But that's some of the things that he's done over the years. And this is Ching Chai's tank in Thailand. This is one of the most impressive tanks in the world. This was also run on Miracle Mud. As was this tank in Italy that I saw. All those corals in this tank were grown from little tiny fragments, none bigger than this. This is roughly 2 years after they were put in the tank. He has a little tiny small skimmer, and he has the whole bottom is a refugium full of Miracle Mud and as much caulerpa as you can imagine. And when you look at into the caulerpa, you can just see so many creatures swimming around in it. You know what's feeding all these corals. Speaking of which, I already gave an answer to this question. Which organism has the largest amount of its body devoted to food capture? Of course, it's the coral. When you look at corals, anywhere from half to 60% of their structure is devoted to food, feeding them. But since the beginning of this hobby, one of the things we were told is, don't feed the corals. You don't need to feed the corals. All you need is light. Well, the reason that we didn't want to feed the corals is we didn't have really good water filtration. So as a result, if we fed the corals, the water quality went down, we grew algae, and the corals died. It was pretty simple. Now that we have much more efficient means for filtration, you have to feed the corals, or you should feed the corals. You don't have to, but you'll get much faster growth. And we also now have a plethora of coral foods to feed the corals with. So by doing that, you can get much faster growth in your corals. This is amphipods and copepods. You can buy them frozen, you can grow them yourself, you can grow plankton. There's just about, or you can just do dried if you're lazy like me. I've tried growing live stuff, but it becomes a whole nother hobby of growing this stuff, making sure your copepods or amphipods or whatever you're growing or plankton don't get in your algae, because once they do, they consume it all and you're stuck. So you got to keep things clean and pure. So I've just gone to using frozen stuff. But when I was in Italy, remember that tank I just showed you? Not only does he have this refugium full of stuff, this is an automatic plankton reactor, which I have never seen before. On the right is green water. On the left is a plankton chamber. Every day, the green water or the plankton chamber dumps out into the tank, dumping all this plankton into the tank. It basically takes out 3/4 of this chamber. Then the green water flows back into there and fills it back up. The plankton eats the green water overnight. The next day, the whole cycle repeats itself. All he has to do is throw in some nutrients for the green water every day, and it automatically feeds his tank. You saw how big and fat those corals were? They were growing, like I said, from pinkies like this, anywhere from 6 to 18 months. I mean, he filled that tank almost immediately because of this plankton system and because of the refugium. I've looked into buying this device. It's about $5,000. I'm not going to spend $5,000 to feed plankton, and I can buy frozen, but this guy obviously had enough money to do that. I mean, if you saw his house and his tank, it was pretty much out of control. But this was a really neat device that I saw when I was over there. Now, in terms of nutrients, this is an interesting article that came out that fish pee is essential to the health of coral reefs. This came about as their research found that as the large predators and stuff are taken off the reef, there's not as much nutrients on the reef because of these fish. So as a result, the corals aren't doing as well. And this reminded me of a story. I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy named Dick Perrin. He's been around the hobby longer than I have, and he has a coral farm up in Romulus, Michigan. And he's been growing these corals in these vats literally forever. About 15 years ago, he gave a talk at Magna. And one of the things that he was famous for was growing clams. He was bringing in clams about the size of a dime, and within 6 months, he had them this size. He was bringing them in, and they were costing him like $1, and he was selling them 6 months later for over $100 a piece. Needless to say, that's a pretty profitable enterprise. So everyone's wondering, Dick, how are you growing these clams so fast? And Magna, if you ever saw Dick, he would go off on tangents. One of the things he said, well, I'll tell you, let you in on a little secret. Eddie and I pee in the clam tank. Now, I know for a fact that people then went home and peed in their tanks because Dick Perrin said he was growing clams as a result. So this got me to think, should I add pee to the tank? No. But I tried to add something that looks similar and has a lot of the same things, amino acids into the tank. So I add Elos amino acids into my tank twice a week. I typically do it in the afternoons or early in the day because corals feed on amino acids or absorb amino acids better during the day, and then at night I feed the plankton. Because what I found was if I reversed them, I wasn't getting as much polyp extension, but by putting the amino acids in during the day and then the food at night, I was using basically the amino acids as like a bell to tell the corals they were going to get fed that night. So at night they would put out their polyps much more, and I got much faster growth and much more uptake of the food. Because before I did that, the skimmer would go nuts the next day. Since I started doing this, the corals are taking out a lot of the food, so they're not going as crazy. I also add Acropower to the tank on a daily basis in a small amount, as I found that acts as well as the amino acids to keep some kind of food or some kind of subsistence in the tank for the corals. And as I said, this is what my tanks look like. So you can see they're jam-packed and as many fish as you could handle in there. In fact, I can't add any more fish into the tank. Anything new that goes in the tank gets killed almost immediately because they've now developed such a territory and such a hierarchy, they can't handle it anymore. Now last year, this interesting article came back. Ornamental halides coming back, making a comeback. The reason that they brought this up is they couldn't grow corals under LEDs. So the question is, why couldn't they grow corals under LEDs? And when they brought up metal halides, they wanted it to act like natural sunlight. Well, if you've ever been diving on a reef, like this one, this is what a natural reef looks like. 99% of the corals are brown. For those of us that have been in the hobby, I remember paying $100 for a coral head that's big, that was brown. And I'd pay $150 if it had a little purple on the tips. Now we're paying $500 for a frag this big because it's as colorful as possible. We've changed things. We don't want natural sunlight in our tanks anymore. Sanjay still does. He still runs 6500K. He'd be using Iwasaki metal halides. But for those of us that like really colorful corals, and he grows colorful corals, we run much more blue light than we used to. This is my old 1,200 gallon tank. It was set up in such a way that it would get sunlight on it for 6 months a year. This is the sunline break. Believe it or not, the picture on the left-hand portion of the tank, that's under 400 watt metal halides. That's how much brighter sunlight is than 400 watt metal halides. It doesn't even look like I have the metal halides on. You can see this is what the metal halides look like. This is how the tank was going. This is as jam-packed a 1,200 gallon tank as you could possibly have. This is my current sunlight tank. I tried putting my SPS corals in there. Unfortunately, they acted like they would under normal sunlight. They turned brown. So I took them all out and put the soft corals in, and they literally grow out of the tank. I mean, I had to go, this was 90 gallons, I had to add it to a 120. I'm probably gonna have to go to a 150 next year because they've grown to the surface every year, particularly in summer. They slow down in the winter, which is a good thing, but for May to October, they basically double their growth rate of what they do the rest of the year. The LEDs and the Reef Bright Strip are just on there for coloration at night, because the tank glows at night. This is what it looks like at night. You can see how the corals grew to the surface in a relatively short period of time. This is my 300-gallon tank when I started running metal halides. Started with 400 watt, then moved down to 250s. This is what the tank looked like. Very good, the corals were colorful, healthy and growing. This is what they look like from above. But then I switched over to the radions. I started with the second generations, and this is what the tank started to look like. You can see much more colorful and much more pleasing to our eyes. I mean, for whatever reason, we as humans like blue light, except for Sanjay, more than we like white light. This is a tank with primarily the blue lights on at night. You can see how vivid the coloration are of things compared with how they were under just the metal halides. And in terms of growth, this is a piece I brought back from Fiji that I saved from the 1200. This is what I grew into in roughly 9 months. But that's nothing. Metal halides, if you have a huge tank, are still cost effective for a big tank. This is a 2,000-gallon tank. You still should probably run metal halides on that. But for smaller tanks, down to 500, LEDs are probably the way to go. And certain corals seem to do better under metal halides. Acropora, at the Penn State tank, grew into colonies this big from frags. And I'm not exaggerating, they were this big and they were getting fragged all the time. The staggards in the back were like this and like this thick around. They switched over to LEDs, they're not getting anywhere near the growth. But the problem with metal halides, you're not going to get coloration like this in the tank. This is what a natural reef looks like. I mean, having been diving, you will swim over a football field to find one colorful coral. And because in natural sunlight, brown is the predominant color. But by changing the dynamics and what we're doing with the lighting, particularly by going to blue, this is the famous Stuper Acropora. This is what it looked like 20 years ago. This is what ORA sells it as now. It has morphed into a colorful coral now. It's no longer brown, it's blue, green, and purple. So we've been able to change it just by changing the lighting on it. And that's what we're doing with a lot of our corals. Here's an interesting coral. This is the same colony. You can see the one extension is purple. Why? That's 2 inches over into bluer light. The bluer light has caused it to go from green to purple. So just a small amount of change can dramatically change the coloration of the light. And if you run a lot of blue lights, this is the kind of coloration you can get in a tank. And those aren't really crazy corals, that's just the coloration they're showing. So if you can't grow corals under LEDs, odds are it's more your parameters than the lighting that you're using. This is Sanjay's tank under LEDs. You can see in some places he has up to 1,200 par, which is a really high number. But for the most part, he's running 200 to 500, which you can grow virtually anything under. This is my tank. I run at a more blue spectrum than a white spectrum, so I'm typically having in the 2 to 400 range. I run a lower amount of light because I'm trying to get more coloration. Sanjay's more into growth. In terms of growth, this is under LEDs. This is after he wiped out his tank 2 years ago. Basically took everything out, refilled it. This is what it looked like 9 months later. This is what it looked like a year and a half later. Oh. Here's one section of the tank. Look at the blue. Look at them a year later. So saying that you can't grow stony corals under LEDs, this pretty much just proves that and how fast you can grow them. When your parameters are good, and I told you, he keeps high nitrates, high phosphates, and high alkalinity, you can grow really fast corals under really bright light. And there's a picture just showing the LEDs. He's running Radion 4th generations now. And that's what I'm running as well. And here's a piece of rock that he cleared off to put frags in. Here's what it looked like 9 months later. And this is just an overflow picture of his tank. So needless to say, we tend to like how corals look under blue lights, and they seem to like the blue light as well. As you look at all the vendors out here with Kessels over their tanks, everybody likes how corals look under blue lights. If they didn't like that, they'd all be running white lights over their tanks. I run reef brights on mine just because I like that bump at the end of the night. The last half hour on all my tanks, it's all reef bright. So it's like, okay, put the sunglasses on. The corals are going to glow for the last 30 minutes of the tank, of the day. And this is a tank with halides and T5s at the top and LEDs on the bottom. You can see the difference in the coloration, primarily with the blues. The first people to really show off and bring this is Worldwide Corals. You can see what their corals look like. If you ever see their show tank under their LEDs and blue lights, it's just amazing. It's like a fireworks display. And they've now been doing this for the last 5 years. Here's another tank under T5s and LEDs. This is the nicest zoanthid tank I've ever seen. I never liked zoanthids until I saw this tank, and then I'm going, you know, I should have a zoanthid tank because this is spectacular coloration. And when you think about it, that's really the only reason any of us really enjoy this is the colors of the corals. SPS corals under LEDs, but you can get a little too carried away. This tank is actually blindingly blue when just the blue lights are on. But we have found one interesting thing with the blue lights. When you see the fluorescence of the corals under the blue lights, it's an indication of how healthy the corals are. I now have a black light to bring out the coloration. When I shine it on corals, I can see where there's pests because the coral won't show the fluorescing there, or I can see when a coral's totally healthy, or I can find when a frag has fallen to the back of the tank, which is where they typically fall to. But looking at the fluorescence of the coral is one way to indicate how healthy your corals are. So running just the blue lights at the end of the night, I get a pretty good idea of which corals are doing well, which corals I really have to pay attention to. Is it a fish nipping them? Is it their neighbor sitting on sweeper tentacles at night? And I can look at that now because of the fluorescence, because of what we learned with blue light. Now, one of the other controversies that I really abhor is photoshopping and macro photography and what they've done to the hobby. This is a spectacular looking mushroom, and all of you that are into mushrooms know this is probably a $2,000 mushroom. The problem is it's not much bigger than my thumbnail. I mean, it's a tiny little mushroom, but it looks beautiful. But what has happened is online, people are adjusting the coloration. They can adjust the hue, the temperature, and the balance and bring out different colorations in corals. And then you order them and you're saying, I want the green with the purple tips. Well, it comes in green with a light blue, or it comes, you bought a green coral or yellow coral, it comes in green. This is because they can adjust that with Photoshop. But now there's actually, I can't remember the name of it, I just found it like a month ago. There's actually a program you can find online that you can pull an online picture to, and it'll take it back to what the coral actually looks like. So to me, that's worth the money, is to plug the picture in before I buy a coral online. I now do that with all of them. And this is the famous or most photoshopped of all corals. This is the Walt Disney. I've seen this coral 100 times. I've seen it look this way once. In anyone's tank, except for Jason's tank, I've never seen it have this coloration. I have 2 colonies of it now, this far apart. They look nice, but they don't look like this. And this is what this coral actually looked like when they brought it in from Bali. I mean, it's a mariculture tenuis that nobody thought a whole lot about. And now that those 2 pictures I showed you, I mean, you can buy a refrigerator for what you can pay for those 2 corals. This is what it looks like, shopped and unshopped. This is the home wrecker. This is an amazing looking coral. I've seen it in Jason's tank. It actually is pretty close to this coloration. Not quite as saturated, but close. This is what a bunch of the frags look like of it. This is an interesting shot. These are 2 frags. The difference in them is here to here. That much of a difference in light changed one from the pink purple to the green, just by having it down 2 inches. So needless to say, if you do not have it in absolutely perfect conditions, you're not going to get this kind of coloration. So you have to really fine tune these. And because of how expensive things have gotten, this is why this hobby is one of the 10 most expensive hobbies money can buy. If you're going to spend $30,000 on a pair of boilie eye angelfish, I understand. Or $200 to $500 for a jawbreaker mushroom that's the size of your pinky nail. Or my favorite, the $6,000 bounce mushroom. I was actually at Reefapalooza when someone paid $6,000 for that. Now, I have to be honest, I actually have bounce mushrooms. I did not pay anything for them. I traded for them before they became the mushroom. I have since traded a few of them. I now have 8 of them that I've propagated, and my goal is to get it to 16 to 20 so I can buy a Porsche. My point of view, I can either have bounce mushrooms or a Porsche. I think I'm going to have a lot more fun in the Porsche. I don't know, maybe it's me, but I'm propagating these things, and they are gorgeous, but it's not worth a Porsche to me. But some people, if any of you really want to buy me a Porsche, I'll trade you the mushrooms today. Or you can spend money on crazy designer clownfish. I still like old percola clowns and anemone. These new ones are nice, but... Or you can spend $1,500 on the first frag of something. This is the Maleficent Acropora from Cornbread. This sold for $1,500. It was no bigger than this. So... That's why this is a funny hobby. When I see mostly men in this hobby, that's because this is what we get. But this is also why now frags are more expensive than a divorce. So keep that in mind when you're spending $800 on a frag. The divorce is only $400. But that's also why they've sold more of these saws than they ever thought possible because of so many people fragging corals. But it's also why so many tanks look like this. Everything is fragged up. Everything is cut immediately. No one grows stuff to big colonies anymore. This is my favorite. I actually saw this acan. Each of those heads sold for $1,000 a piece. This is a $21,000 acanthastria. Again, there's a Porsche here. Difference between a coral head and a Porsche, or half of a coral head in a refrigerator or a stove. Something's wrong, in my point of view. So I can't see how this is going to continue. I actually wrote about this morning in Reef Builders. I can't see how this crazy prices can continue forever. And I do have a pleasure room. This is what my pleasure room looks like. Television set on the side, tank here, 2 tanks along the side, and a bathroom over in the corner. Never have to leave the room. And as we've discussed, there's a lot of money in this hobby, but you don't necessarily have to spend a ton of money to have a very nice tank. This is a beautiful looking tank. It's a soft coral tank. Typically everything that's promoted is you have to have a really expensive SPS tank. For my money, this is just as nice as most of the SPS tanks I have, and it's actually more relaxing. I showed you my soft coral tank. It's more relaxing because I don't have to worry about the parameters all the time. I'm not constantly moving stuff around. There's water flow, the corals are moving. It's a very relaxing tank to look at. You can go with just LPS and Gonioporas and still get a nice looking tank. Or this is part of my frag tank where I have a bunch of colonies of acans. It's still just as nice looking. It's not as expensive as some of the stuff that's out there. And these were all grown from 1 or 2 polyps into this, covering the whole bottom of the tank. This is my nano tank. This is 26 gallons. There's a bunch of little tiny fish in here. This is also an easy tank. You don't have to have a 500-gallon tank to enjoy this hobby or to spend a lot of money in. You can get away with a small nano tank. And I said, this is the most spectacular little tank. These are all Zoes under LED, blue LEDs. You can see how beautifully colored this is. I mean, and one of the things that I now do when I design tanks is I make it so you can look at it from the top. As nice as the tank looks from the front, when you look at it from the top, it's 10 times better. Because the corals are all growing toward the light. You have much better coloration. So every tank I've had, except for the 300, which is too high, the next one will be lower. All the filtration will be over to the side, so I can look at it from the top. That was the beauty of the 1,200-gallon tank. I could look down here, the top of the tank was right here. I mean, it was amazing to look at that tank from above. This is Sanjay's tank. These are not, for the most part, named corals. Other than the Oregon Tort, which started as a frag like this, these are simple, everyday corals, but it's a spectacular-looking tank. You can do a little coral bombing. Just a few corals at the top, live rock in the center, reaching out. You don't have to go crazy and fill every space. And as I said, my favorite is still a pair of clownfish and an anemone. I mean, you put that in a 20-gallon tank, you're gonna have hours of watching that. Throw in a couple shrimp or crabs to annoy them, and you got entertainment for you and the kids for hours. And another really nice nano tank. And you don't need every piece of equipment and all the technology to have a nice looking tank. This is very simple. 2 lights, a skimmer, a water pump, and a power head. That's all that's on this tank. Constant flow moving around, anemones reproducing in the tank. It's a very simple tank. That's really all you need. This is my sunlight tank. Very simple. Pumps, Miracle Mud filtration, two power heads, and that's basically it on this tank. This is one of the things we all look at. When I look at what the prices of frags are out there, we'll get mad about spending 20 bucks on some at the grocery and then we'll spend $200 on a frag. This is my frag tank. You can see how packed it is. You don't have to have the most expensive fish or corals. Those are Acropora cardinal fish. I paid $18 a piece for them. They were this big. Now they're this big. They're in my 300. I have a camera on the tank, so when I'm away I can look at the tank. I know the tank's healthy because every night I can see their blue eyes swimming back and forth, so I know the tank's healthy. That's how I really like these fish, except they got really bigger than I thought. But you don't need something elaborate. These are two caps with a little Acropora growing in the middle of them. You start them all from frags and just let them grow like this. You can have something really interesting and cheap, just like this. Because a lot of people will give you cap frags because it grows like weeds. Now, if you didn't take anything else or learn nothing else from my talk today, one of the things I want you to all know, quarantine and acclimate your fish and corals. As I told you, I have that 300-gallon tank. I cannot put anything in that tank. Fortunately, I have 4 other tanks I can put stuff in. Anything new I get gets quarantined for at least a month, sometimes usually up to 3 months. Then, before I put it in the tank, I put an acrylic box in the tank. I put the fish in the box. I let the other fish in the tank get used to the fish in the box. If I just take the fish out of quarantine, they're eating, they're healthy and everything, and put them in the tank, it's like the new kid in school. Everyone hits them. A lot of times they don't eat, they hide all the time, and they die. When you have a pair of Earl's wrasse that are worth $1,000, you want to acclimate them properly. These fish were acclimated for 3 months, sat in a box for a month in the tank. Everyone was used to them. When I put them in the tank, no one bothered them, they're fine. The same thing with corals. With LED lights, we have them on top of our tank. They don't look very bright. The reason they don't look very bright, if you had metal halides before, the metal halides lit the whole room. LEDs are like laser beams. All the light is focused down in the tank. So while we don't perceive them as very bright, all the light's going this way. If you put your corals in and stick them at the top right away, it's like the first day you go out in the spring and it's full sunshine. Guess what? You get sunburn. Guess what? The corals bleach and burn. Start your corals at the bottom when you put them in. Acclimate them slowly. They're not going anywhere. They're not going to start growing for a couple months after you put them in the tank anyway. So let them get acclimated to things. Let them get used to the lighting. Move them up. You won't lose as many. And that's where you're going to save money, is not having to replace stuff. Because that's the worst thing you have to do. You buy a new coral. 3 weeks later it suddenly bleaches. You can't figure out why. It bleached because it wasn't accustomed to the lighting. You can put it right at the top, right at the beginning. Start them at the bottom. Gradually move them up. This is a pond box that you're supposed to put filtration medium in. All the water flows through it. All my corals go in this box. All the corals start at the bottom. There's a magnet on the side. Gradually move them up to the level I want them to. Take them out, put them in. I don't get bleaching anymore. Really simple. Now, one of the things that we're under threat from, and one of the controversies is, do we do a significant amount of harm on the reef? Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, we've heard about the horrible bleaching events that have occurred in the last 2 years. It is the most well-managed reef in the world. The Australian government, and we know government is not a big fan of the hobby or reef people, basically found we have no impact on the reef at all. The amount of stuff we take off and how we take it off, basically it's broken pieces, it's frags. We're not taking big colonies like this like we used to. We're taking pretty much the scraps off the reef. Found that we don't cause any problem. But they also found an interesting thing. If they looked at just the food fish are worth $6 per kilogram. Hobbyist fish are worth $500 per kilogram. So guess which one the government wants to take out more? Ornamental fish, if they're smart, because 500, I'm not good at math, but 500 I think is still bigger than 6. So they're starting to push for, in these smart governments, not like here in Hawaii, that it's worthwhile for them to promote ornamental fish. The interesting thing they also found was that the reefs themselves are worth roughly $6.9 trillion. That's a significant amount of money. However, one of the things they neglected, they didn't realize that a little frag of Walt Disney is worth $1,000. So that would definitely increase the price or value of what the ocean's worth. In Indonesia, they used to eat skate wings all the time. This is a manta ray. A manta ray they found is worth $1 million in tourism. So needless to say, you no longer can get skate wings in Indonesia because they found that having divers and tourists look at manta rays is worthwhile. Once people understand the value of stuff, like we do, none of us would go out and dynamite a reef, throw cyanide in a reef or anything else, but the environmentalists that come after us think that's what we're doing. When in reality, we're promoting mariculture. We want to make sure the reefs survive, because if something happens to the reef, we have corals that we can then put back out there. All the stuff that they're doing to repopulate, like around Miami and in the Caribbean, is because of some of the things that we've learned over the years of how to grow corals, how to propagate them, how to get them to big enough size, and even how to mount them. I mean, 15 years ago, they had no idea how to mount a coral. Now we have different epoxies and other ways. We mount them down. 2 years later, they have reefs coming back. So we've done a significant amount of good for the oceans, and the environmentalists have not liked that. This is what a healthy reef looks like. The next big thing that's coming for us is Philippines. We've been waiting for Philippine corals now for the last 20 years. I've had friends that have been diving in the Philippines, and this is why. When these kind of corals come in, these are the things that we want. They're a lot brighter and even nicer colored than Australia. Why? Because the Philippines has more different species of corals and fish than anywhere else, even more than the Great Barrier Reef. But we've not been able to bring in corals for the last 30 years. But supposedly they're going to start coming in. But as with those corals, and you're starting to see virtually everything being cultured. You're seeing cultured, besides Acropora, you're seeing cultured chalices, you're seeing cultured euphyllias, you're seeing cultured everything. So the reason they're culturing it, there's money in it. So this is where the next big thing is going in the hobby. However, we still have to worry about things getting banned, like these lionfish in the Atlantic, which they try to blame on a hobbyist dumping a tank in, when in reality, I won't name a name, but there was a casino that had an open ocean aquarium, and in it, they had a dozen of the biggest lionfish you ever saw that they fed heavily every day. Well, heavily fed lionfish probably want to do one thing, and that's mate. Well, where did their gametes go? Back out into the ocean. Well, they weren't native to there, but they were in this aquarium. Since this has been banned, suddenly those lionfish are no longer at that casino. So, needless to say, that's probably where they started from. Not from some hobbyist during a flood losing one lionfish in the ocean. So, and if you look at where they started, it was right within the vicinity of this casino. So, we're not to blame for that. But we are ingenious, and then we come up with ways to kill them. This is an electrocution system for lionfish. It sits at the bottom. If the lionfish goes in between it, it gets electrocuted. So where there's a will, there's a way with a hobby. And one of which, where there's a will, there's a way, is the breeding of things. Biota is now breeding a lot of different fish and bringing them into the hobby. These are the Biota coral beauties, but they're also hopefully going to start looking at things that I want, like these Debilius angels that sell for $15,000 a piece, because they only come from Mauritius, and there's only one collecting station in Mauritius, and they get about 5 of these a year. So if they start propagating these, because they should propagate or be able to breed them just as easily as coral beauties, this is definitely something I'd want in my tank. Or like these that were bred 2 years ago, and these Personifer angels, which were sold for $10,000 a piece, and they grew 200 of them. So basically this was a $2 million project. So for those of you that have a lot of free time, that want to make a lot of money, that's the ticket. Now, fish are a lot smarter than we think, and they can recognize your face. That's why when you walk in to feed the fish, they all jump to the front. They recognize your face as a source of food. So the question is, are they smarter or are we smarter? I'm basically of the opinion that they're smarter, because any of you that have tried to catch a fish out of your reef tank knows it's an impossibility. They're much smarter at it than we are. But we can get smarter by reading. There's still a lot of literature out there, and I'm a big advocate of reading books and magazines rather than just reading everything off the internet. The reason being is, if you write a book, your name is to that article. If you're on the internet, you could be a 12-year-old kid with a 10-gallon tank, but you have 5,000 posts, so you're considered an expert. So until there's some reliability, I'm still a big fan of reading. I'm also a big fan of getting your kids involved in a hobby. And one of the things I see less and less of are kids taking over. I've had fish now since I was 5, and at that time I remember a lot of my friends also having fish tanks. Now when I go into stores, come to events like this, or go anywhere, I see very few kids involved in the hobby. So my concern is the next generation is not going to be as involved in this as we are. Now, I write an article on reef builders every Saturday morning. Saturday morning coffee, it's my opinion of different things. This week it's on things that scare me in the hobby. You may agree or disagree, but it's just things that I actually talked about today. And if you want to know how long I've been doing this, this is the first Acropora I ever brought in. It could be Stuper Acropora. This is 1991. I used to fly out to California. There was a place called Aquatic Depot that would bring in SPS corals on Wednesday night. I would fly in Wednesday afternoon, sit there and wait, open the boxes at Aquatic Depot, pick out 6 or 8 corals, then catch the red eye home. And I would sleep on the bed between Steve Tyree's tanks in his bedroom. He had 2 tanks on either side. So that's how long I've been doing this. And as I said, before and after, I always show you what my tanks look like so you can have an idea if I have a clue what I'm talking about. These are my 2 favorite Longnose Hawkfish. They spawn like every 2 weeks. And part of the fun of this hobby is to make as many friends in it as you can. I've now been friends with Sanjay and Kevin for over 25 years. So needless to say, I've been doing this longer than some of you have been born. And some people think I look like Kevin, Mr. Wonderful. I tend to disagree. So as I wrap things up, if you want to get in touch with me, I'm happy to answer any questions. I do answer everything on Facebook, which is the easiest way to get in touch with me. And just remember, everything either begins or ends in the sea. All depends on your perspective. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks.